Vice President under John Quincy Adams and later under Jackson, supporting nullification, and President Andrew Jackson supporting the power of the federal government to enact tariffs. Jackson argued that nullification would give a state the ability to resist all laws and collapse the federal union. In July 1832, Congress enacted the Tariff Act of 1832, but it did not go far enough to address the grievances of the southern states. On November 24, 1832, South Carolina adopted the Ordinance of Nullification and declared the tariffs of 1828 and 1832 null and void. Congress authorized the use of force against South Carolina to enforce federal law, and South Carolina prepared to defend itself against federal forces. The situation was diffused by the Tariff Act of 1833, which gradually reduced tariffs down to 20%. In conclusion, rising federalism leading to new powers for the federal government, stripping away rights guaranteed under the First Amendment, the responding theory of nullification, which was validated by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, protectionist tariffs and their unequal effect on the southern states versus the northern states led to crises and eventually the Civil War. Secession, the belief that states are free, independent, and sovereign states with all the powers of statehood. The conflict between the interest of the northern states, the southern states, the issue of slavery in the territories came to a head in 1860 and 1861. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina issued the Declaration of the Immediate Causes which induce and justify the secession of South Carolina from the federal union. In that document, the Assembly argued that the Declaration of Independence declared that the 13 colonies were free and independent states, and that as free and independent states, they have full rights to operate as states to levy war, contract alliances, make peace, establish commerce, and basically do everything else a state can do. Further, they argued that since the Declaration of Independence was made in response to the abuses of Great Britain, the colonies were absolved of all allegiance to the British Crown and political connection. On September 3, 1783, when a treaty was signed by Great Britain, it acknowledged the independence of the colonies and named each colony as a free, sovereign, and independent state. The Articles of Union were agreed to by colonies who entered into it, and those who did not ratify it remained free and independent. South Carolina then argued that the Constitution had been breached by the federal government, and since the states had the ability to agree and ratify the Constitution, they could likewise dissolve their relationship with the federal government. As evidence, South Carolina cited Article 4, Clause 3, the Fugitive State Clause, which the free states had bypassed or nullified. South Carolina argued that the clause was so vitally important that they would not have agreed to the Constitution without it. Jefferson Davis and the leaders of the southern states believed that states were sovereign entities and could secede if they wanted to. He believed that states should make their own decision about slavery. Following the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, Davis felt that the abolition of slavery was inevitable. The Mississippi House of Representatives had voted to secede on January 9, 1861. Davis argued in the Senate that Mississippi had been deprived of its rights bequeathed to her that cited all men are free, all races are equal, but he believed the above 2 points only applied to men of the political community. Davis argued that the northern free states had nullified the Fugitive Slave Law by passing laws to bypass or nullify the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. He believed that this was an attack on Mississippi's social institutions. He also cited that the Constitution specifically stated that slaves were equal to 3/5 and thus not equal to white men. Specifically, the Constitution referred to other persons, i.e. slaves, in Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3. This was a reference to how many representatives each state could send to Congress and how taxes can be apportioned. In conclusion, the belief that states have the sovereign right to decide to enter the Union and also the right to decide when and how they wanted to leave led to the secession of southern states from the Union. They formed the Confederate States of America and ultimately brought about the U.S. Civil War. The wealth of the southern states was locked up in the value of slaves and their resources cheap labor. Southern state assemblies were not about to give up their economies that were based upon cheap labor and slave ownership. The southern states were criticized for nullifying the tariff laws that protected the North, but at the cost of Southern agrarian states. Southerners found it to be very inconsistent when many Northern states nullified or passed laws to bypass the Slave Act of 1850. When the British Parliament attempted to use revenues collected from the colonies to pay for war debts incurred by England and prop up enterprises like the East India Company, many colonists objected. They developed a deep sense of distrust because no one likes to be manipulated or treated unfairly. When frustrations boiled over into protests, Parliament tried to rein in the colonies through punitive acts that backfired. Ultimately, the War of Independence resulted, giving birth to a new nation. When the United States formed out of the free and independent colonies, some states believed that they had retained rights, such as nullification or the right to own slaves. This led to the Nullification Crisis and ultimately the Civil War. Government distrust was a huge issue that resulted in the American War for Independence and Civil War, conflicts that define us as a nation. The strong ideals of fair tax treatment and the separation of powers that states have retained from those granted to the federal government by the free and independent states resonate today. Recent initiatives in 2022, led by President Joe Biden, to pass federal election laws fly in the face of the U.S. Constitution. President Biden recently commented that state voting laws are election subversion and that it's simply unconscionable. Unfortunately for the president, he is completely wrong. The Constitution provides powers to the states to determine the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives. It's curious that he would criticize the states for exercising their powers. Let's remember that following the War of Independence, the colonies were free and independent, able to make their own treaties and alliances. The document that defines how our nation operates clearly gives this power to the states, which was agreed to at the time of our nation's founding. The Constitution further states that Congress can pass laws to alter voting regulations. However, in 2022, President Biden failed to convince the Senate to create federal voting laws that would supersede the states. Joe Biden seems to be acting as a modern-day federalist, a James Madison. One could argue very easily that federalism reduces liberty by taking more powers away from the state assemblies, which are elected by local citizenry. In case we make the mistake of thinking that nullification is a dead concept, we can see it happening today through recent laws by several states, including New York and New Jersey, that are designed to subvert federal cap of state and local tax deductions, otherwise known as SALT. SALT deductions are kept to $10,000 for most W-2 wage earners. However, these states have helped small business owners evade payment of federal taxes by passing acts allowing small business owners to deduct SALT payments from their personal income. When states pass laws to bypass federal ones at the expense of others, distrust results. State laws designed to bypass federal laws, such as the Fugitive Slave Acts, were significant contributing factors to the Civil War. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Paul Christopher Show. Keep an eye out for my next episode covering distrust in the U.S. Part 2 from the Reconstruction period through Vietnam. Thanks for listening and have a great day.